Harold Wainwright and Thomas Grigg, one a respected undertaker, the other his ambitious assistant, hid secrets so dark that even the foggy streets of Victorian London could not conceal them. In 2022, during the renovation of an old townhouse on Hanbury Street in East London, a group of builders stumbled upon something strange buried deep beneath the worn wooden floorboards. The house, once part of a row of crumbling Victorian buildings, had been marked for restoration. Its structure was weak, the walls cracked, and the scent of damp history filled every room. As one of the workers pried open the rotten planks near the fireplace, his hammer struck something hollow. At first, they assumed it was debris or a forgotten toy, but when the dust cleared, a small, time-worn wooden box emerged, carefully wrapped in layers of cloth that had turned brown with age. Inside the box lay three peculiar items: a silver pocket watch, a bundle of faded photographs, and a small diary tied shut with string. The photographs showed stern faces of men and women dressed in Victorian clothing, their expressions unreadable. Some were blurred, as if taken in haste, and on the back of one was scrawled a name, H. Wainwright. The pocket watch was engraved with the same initials, but it was the diary that held the real mystery. The cover was cracked and fragile, and when opened it revealed pages filled with trembling handwriting that spoke of fear, guilt, and crimes committed in silence. At first, the workers thought it was some form of fiction, perhaps a prop left behind by a previous owner. But the details were too vivid, too dark, and too specific to be a simple story. It described acts of theft, deceit, and something far worse, acts of murder. The writer confessed to following unworthy men through the foggy streets of London and punishing them in the name of redemption. The diary hinted at hidden bodies, unmarked graves, and stolen fortunes buried beneath the cobblestones of a city that never slept. Each page dripped with obsession, and each confession was dated between 1888 and 1891, the same period when London had been gripped by fear from the infamous Whitechapel murders. The discovery reached the attention of a local historian, who immediately recognized the historical value of the find. The handwriting matched old police reports from the late Victorian period that mentioned an unidentified suspect known only by the initial. Those reports had linked H to a series of unsolved disappearances involving dockworkers, traders, and travelers who had vanished after visiting East End taverns. None of those cases had ever been solved, and no bodies had been recovered. As investigators began examining the diary more closely, they realized they were holding a direct confession from a long-lost criminal whose name had been erased from official history. Each entry seemed to lead deeper into a hidden world, a shadowy version of Victorian London that thrived beneath the surface of civility. There was something eerie about how carefully the box had been hidden, as though the writer knew it would be found one day long after he was gone. The discovery was no longer just a historical curiosity. It was evidence, and as the words within the diary began to unravel, the team understood they were about to uncover a forgotten story of greed, murder, and guilt that had been buried for over a century, an untold chapter of crime in the heart of the Victorian age. The diary's early entries painted a chilling portrait of the man behind the initials H. He referred to his only as Mr. H, never revealing his full name, as though he knew the power of anonymity. His handwriting was elegant but erratic, filled with sudden changes in tone, sometimes calm and reflective, other times wild and unsteady. Through his words, a sinister picture emerged of a man who moved like a shadow through the narrow, gas-lit streets of Victorian London. He described how he would walk the alleys of Whitechapel at night, blending into the fog that rolled in from the river, watching the desperate and the rich alike. To some, he appeared as a gentleman, tipping his hat and offering polite smile. To others he was nothing more than a ghostly figure, vanishing around corners before anyone could truly see him. Mr. H claimed to be a collector of lost fortunes, a man who believed he was restoring balance to a corrupt world. He wrote of targeting merchants, gamblers, and traders who had fed upon the poor, seeing himself as both thief and judge. In one passage, he mentioned how he could stand behind a man in a crowded tavern and already know his weaknesses: greed, vanity, fear, His victims, he said, were chosen not by chance but by character. He lured them into dark corners with promises of investment, partnership or friendship, and then took everything they had, including, it seemed, their lives. Police records from that era later confirmed several mysterious disappearances, matching his descriptions. Wealthy tradesmen were reported missing after visiting drinking houses in the East End, their last sightings always close to the docks or in poorly lit alleys. None of their bodies were ever recovered, and the authorities at the time had hedged they had fled the city or drowned after a night of drunken misfortune. The diary, however, told a different story, one of deliberate planning and cold execution. Mr. wrote of poisons, secret hiding places, and the river's silence, a phrase he repeated often, as if the Thames itself was his partner in crime. But what made his writings truly disturbing was the absence of remorse. He didn't describe himself as evil, but as enlightened. He believed that society had abandoned its morals, that crime had become the only honest profession left in a world full of hypocrisy. His tone was almost philosophical, pondering justice and power, as if he were conducting an experiment rather than committing murder. He even noted how he felt invisible to the police, describing them as blind men chasing fog. The investigators who studied the diary realized they weren't just reading a confession, they were stepping into the twisted mind of a man who lived between two worlds. By day he was a respectable figure, unnoticed among London's thousands. By night, he became something else, a silent predator who turned the city's shadows into his domain. As the entries continued, one thing became clear. Mr. H's crimes weren't impulsive acts of desperation, they were carefully designed performances, each one rehearsed with precision, and somewhere in the smog-choked streets of Whitechapel, his dark theater had once played to an audience of none. Among the diary's many dark confessions, one stood out more than the rest, a detailed account of a man known only as the gentleman from Bristol. Unlike other entries filled with vague hints and riddles, this one was precise, almost meticulous, as if the writer had wanted it to be found. He described the man as a proud merchant who wore a silver ring shaped like a serpent and carried with him a shipment of gold coins destined for a London bank. Historical archives later revealed that this man was Edwin Corbett, a well-known trader whose disappearance in 1890 had caused a brief stir in the newspapers before being forgotten. According to reports, Corbett had arrived in London on business but vanished after an evening spent at a tavern near the docks. His ship returned to Bristol without him, and his fortune was never accounted for. In the diary, Mr. H detailed his pursuit of Corbett with chilling calmness. He followed the merchant from the docks to a crowded tavern, watching him through the smoke and laughter of the crowd. He described how the man boasted of his wealth, unaware that his every word was sealing his fate. The diary spoke of a dark tonic poured into a glass, something that would still the tongue and slow the heart. Once Corbett fell unconscious, Mr. H wrote of dragging him through the narrow alleys under the cover of thick fog. He described the sound of the man's boots scraping against the stones and the distant toll of church bells that seemed to mock his. What happened next was perhaps the most haunting part. Mr. H claimed to have buried Corbett under the sleeping stones by the river, a phrase that puzzled investigators for weeks. When historians and police researchers revisited this clue, they traced it to a row of derelict warehouses along the Thames, once used to store coal and goods. Beneath one of these sites, in what had become a sealed-off cellar, ground-penetrating scans revealed a buried cavity. The excavation was carried out carefully, layer by layer, until finally a human skeleton emerged from the damp soil. The remains were dressed in tattered Victorian clothing, and on one finger gleamed a silver ring shaped like a serpent, exactly as described in the diary. Forensic analysis confirmed that the bones dated back to the late 19th century. Although no soft tissue remained, traces of mercury and laudanum were found in the soil near the body, substances often used as sedatives or poisons in Victorian times. The discovery proved that the diary was not a work of fiction, but a true record of a murder long buried beneath the city's history. News of the findings spread quickly, capturing public fascination. Historians called it one of the most remarkable cold case discoveries of the century. Yet the deeper significance lay not just in solving a single murder, but in realizing how many more might still be hidden. The diary mentioned others, unnamed men, who met similar fates. The story of Edwin Corbett was only one chapter in a much larger pattern of calculated cruelty, orchestrated by a man who had moved undetected through the heart of Victorian London, using its fog and chaos as his perfect disguise. The diary's next entries hinted at a place Mr. H. called his room of silence. He described it as a sanctuary, a place where he could reflect on his actions and preserve the memories of those who taught him the value of wealth and death. The phrasing was cryptic, but investigators believed it referred to a hidden location where he stored belongings taken from his victims. Each item, he wrote, was a token of a lesson, something he could touch to remember how easily power changed hands. For weeks, historians and crime researchers studied property records from the late 19th century, searching for buildings once owned by anyone named Wainwright, or they discovered one entry that stood out. A small townhouse in Spitalfields, registered under the name Henry Walters, which later turned out to be an alias. The property, abandoned for decades, stood in a narrow street lined with decaying brick houses. Its windows were boarded up, and its entrance was sealed with rusted chains. When investigators finally gained access, the air inside was heavy with the scent of dust and mold. Everything was covered in a thick layer of grime. Yet the structure seemed strangely preserved, as if time itself had been afraid to disturb it. The team moved cautiously through the rooms until one of them noticed a section of the basement wall that sounded hollow when tapped. Behind the bricks lay a hidden doorway, sealed tight with mortar that appeared older than the rest of the house. When the bricks were carefully removed, they revealed a small underground chamber. The moment the first beam of light entered the room, it caught the glint of metal, glass, and gold. Inside were dozens of objects neatly arranged on old wooden shelves: pocket watches, silver rings, coins, women's brooches, cufflinks, and handwritten letters. Many items were engraved with initials or family names. It was a secret gallery of stolen lives, a trophy room kept in perfect order. On one wall hung several framed photographs, their images almost faded beyond recognition. Most showed ordinary Victorians posing stiffly before cameras, but in one photograph a faint silhouette of a man stood at the edge of the frame, his face turned away. Every item was catalogued and traced. Several pieces were soon connected to missing persons reports from the same period described in the diary. Among the letters found in the room were notes of affection, unfinished correspondence, and business receipts belonging to men who had vanished between 1888 and 1891. The handwriting and ink used on the envelopes matched the time period exactly. What made the discovery more disturbing was how carefully everything had been preserved, as though Mr. H expected to return. For the investigative team, this was more than physical evidence. It was an archaeological reconstruction of a killer's mind. Each item told a fragment of a story, each name another thread in a web of deceit and death. In that silent, airless room beneath the Spitalfields house, time had stopped. The room of silence Mr. H described in his diary was no metaphor. It was real, and within it the ghosts of his victims still lingered, unseen, but finally no longer unheard. The discovery of the secret chamber opened a new path in the investigation, and as researchers delved deeper into the diary, a startling truth emerged. The man who had called himself Miss She was not some faceless drifter, but a respected figure in Victorian London, Harold Wainwright, an undertaker by profession. The revelation came from a small ink sketch found between the diary's pages. It was a rough self-portrait labeled only "In the Mirror, the Man They Trust." The sketch showed a clean-shaven gentleman wearing a tall hat and formal coat. When historians compared the drawing to public records, they found a near-perfect resemblance to Harold Wainwright, who had owned a funeral business near Whitechapel during the late 80s. Wainwright's reputation had been one of compassion and service. He was known for providing affordable burials for the poor, often taking charity cases when families could not afford to pay. Church documents from the time even mentioned him as a man of kindness and quiet dignity, but the diary exposed the horrifying truth behind that image. Wainwright had used his profession as a mask to conceal his crimes. In one entry, he wrote that he laid the living among the dead, and the dead among the lies. He had found a way to profit from death itself. The diary explained how he often accepted payment for burials that never took place. He would report that a coffin had been buried in the city's overcrowded cemeteries, when, in reality, it was empty. Sometimes, he used these false graves to hide his victims. By exploiting his position, he avoided suspicion. After all, who would question an undertaker about the whereabouts of the dead? He had access to graveyards, hearses, and unmarked plots, all tools that served his secret purpose. The fog-covered cemeteries of London had been his perfect hiding place. The investigators discovered that several of the items found in the Room of Silence matched names from Harold's business regs. Clients who had supposedly been buried, but whose graves were either missing or contained no remains. This realization turned the case from a curiosity into one of the most chilling examples of deception in British criminal history. Wainwright had lived a double life for years, attending church on Sundays while burying evidence of his crimes during the week. Newspaper archives revealed that his business had abruptly closed in 1891, with no official explanation. Some neighbors at the time recalled that the funeral home's windows were suddenly shuttered and its owner vanished without warning. To the outside world, he might have seemed like another victim of misfortune, swallowed by the same poverty he once profited from. But the diary suggested something different, that he had planned his own disappearance as carefully as he had planned his murders. The investigators realized they were not just uncovering a killer but dismantling an illusion. A man who had walked through Victorian London, wearing the face of respectability, all while turning funerals into crimes and graves into hiding places. Harold Wainwright had not only buried the dead, he had buried his true self beneath layers of deceit and silence. As the investigators turned to the later pages of the diary, they found a noticeable change in tone. The careful handwriting that had once flowed in long, confident lines grew uneven and hurried, as though the writer's mind was unraveling. The words became darker, filled with hints of paranoia and fear. It was clear that something or someone had begun to threaten Harold Wainwright's secret. The diary spoke of betrayal, of a person who had seen too much and asked for more. This person, as later entries revealed, was Thomas Grigg, a young man who had worked as Harold's assistant at the funeral business. Thomas had joined Wainwright's establishment in 1890, only a year before the entries ended. Historical employment records confirmed his existence. A boy of 21, hired to help with grave preparations and coffin deliveries. In the early pages that mentioned him, Harold referred to Thomas with a tone of pride, describing him as eager, clever, and trustworthy. But as time passed, the tone shifted. The diary began to describe Thomas as curious, greedy, and ungrateful. It appeared that the young man had discovered inconsistencies in the undertaker's work: empty coffins, false death certificates, and suspicious late-night deliveries. One entry described how Thomas confronted his employer, demanding a share of the profits in exchange for silence. Harold's writing from that night was almost manic, filled with anger and betrayal. He described how the boy had looked into the mouth of the abyss and smiled. He couldn't allow that. In the following pages he hinted at his plan with terrifying precision, writing, "There is only one way to silence a voice that knows too much. It must be swallowed by the river that forgives all sins." When the investigators cross-referenced this claim, they uncovered an official report from 1891, the death of Thomas Grigg, found drowned in the River Thames near Southwark. The coroner at the time ruled it an accident, citing intoxication. There was no investigation, no suspicion of foul play, but the diary told a different story. Harold confessed that he had met Thomas under the pretense of discussing business, offered him a drink, and laced it with laudanum before pushing him into the dark water. His words were cold, matter-of-fact. He sank quietly, like all the others. After Thomas's death, Harold's writing grew increasingly erratic. He wrote of feeling watched, of hearing footsteps outside his home, of seeing Thomas's face reflected in puddles. The once calculated criminal had begun to crumble under his own guilt or madness. He described the city as turning against him, the fog whispering his name, the graves accusing him in silence. He confessed that he no longer slept, fearing the sound of the river outside his window. It was clear that Thomas's death had broken something in him. He could silence the boy's voice, but not the memory of what he had done. In his final lines about Thomas, Harold wrote that the apprentice became the master of my conscience, a phrase investigators interpreted as an acknowledgement of the young man's haunting presence in his mind. It was the first sign that the killer's confidence had collapsed, and his carefully constructed world was beginning to decay from within. Character name. After the final entry about Thomas Grigg, the diary became fragmented, as if Harold Wainwright had begun writing in moments of panic rather than control. His sentences were shorter, sometimes incomplete, filled with thoughts that seemed to chase each other without conclusion. The calm precision of his earlier confessions had vanished, replaced by a sense of urgency and despair. He wrote about being followed through the streets, about seeing faces in the fog that seemed familiar, and about strangers watching him from across the marketplace. Whether these fears were real or the result of guilt-driven madness, no one could tell. But what became clear was that Harold Wainwright was preparing to disappear. The last recorded date in the diary was November 1891. After that, all traces of him vanished from public record. His home and funeral business were found abandoned, with no sign of struggle or forced entry. The neighbors said that one morning the curtains remained drawn, and by the end of the week, the undertaker's sign had been taken down. Some believed he had fled London to escape debt or disgrace. Others whispered that he had joined the ranks of his own victims, swallowed by the very shadows he once controlled. The truth, however, remained hidden for over a century. The final pages of the diary offered the only clue. They contained a haunting message, written in faint, uneven ink. I shall rest where the city cannot find me, in the Garden of Ashes. For months, investigators debated what this meant. Some thought it referred to a crematorium, but such places were rare in the 1890s. Others believed it was symbolic, a poetic description of suicide or disappearance. But a historian specializing in Victorian burial customs suggested another interpretation. In that era, Gardens of Ashes was a phrase occasionally used to describe neglected cemeteries, places where graves had been left to decay, their headstones broken and names forgotten. Using this theory, the team examined burial sites that existed on the outskirts of London in the late 19th century. After cross-referencing property maps with Harold's business records, they found a derelict cemetery near the old outskirts of Hackney. It had been closed for over 100 years, overgrown with weeds and trees. Near the center of the grounds stood a collapsed mausoleum with no inscription. Beneath its rubble lay a sealed wooden coffin, unmarked and oddly isolated from the others. Inside were skeletal remains dressed in what had once been a black undertaker's coat. In the bony hand rested a familiar object, a silver pocket watch engraved with the initials. DNA analysis later confirmed the remains were consistent with Harold Wainwright's lineage. There were no signs of violence, no indication of murder. It was likely he had taken his own life, choosing to vanish into the same silence he had so often used to hide his crimes. The watch had stopped at precisely 3:17, its mechanism rusted solid, a symbol of a life that had finally run out of time. For more than a century, Harold had slept in the Garden of Ashes he himself had described, his confession waiting beneath the city to be discovered. The man who had buried so many secrets had in the end buried himself. The discovery of Harold Wainwright's remains brought a century-old mystery to an end, but it also opened new questions about how a man could live two entirely separate lives, one of public decency and another of hidden evil. The confirmation of his identity and crimes was not merely the solution to an old case. It was the unveiling of a secret London had forgotten it ever kept. Forensic experts, historians, and criminologists gathered to piece together the full story, connecting the diary, the victims, and the secret chamber beneath Spitalfields. What they revealed was the life of a man who had exploited both his profession and his society's blindness, hiding in plain sight during one of the darkest periods of Victorian history. In the months following the discovery, the diary was preserved and studied in detail. Each page offered a glimpse into Wainwright's fractured psychology. He wasn't a mindless killer, but a man who saw himself as an agent of balance, a twisted reformer seeking to correct the world's injustice by his own cruel hand. His victims were not random but chosen from those he believed had corrupted London's soul through greed or deceit. Yet, beneath his justifications lay a cold hunger for control and recognition. He wanted to be seen as a judge of morality, yet he lived by none. That contradiction became his downfall. The diary's final words, "The city has taken enough, now I take what remains," showed a man who had come to believe he was both victim and executioner, consumed by his own sense of purpose. The case captivated the public. Documentaries, books, and academic papers emerged, each trying to understand how a man like Wainwright could operate undetected, while the police hunted other infamous criminals of his era. Some called him the Silent Undertaker, a name that quickly spread through media headlines. Others drew comparisons to the notorious killers of the 19th century, though Harold's motives were colder and more deliberate. His crimes were not driven by passion or impulse, but by design and arrogance. He believed himself smarter than the world that surrounded him, a belief that had held true until the day his hidden box was discovered under that decaying floorboard. When his story finally aired in a televised documentary, viewers across the country were haunted by the eerie parallels between Wainwright's London and their own modern city. The same narrow streets, the same fog, the same sense of history buried just beneath the surface. The closing scenes showed the pocket watch and the diary displayed side by side in a glass case at the Museum of London, relics of a life that had blurred the line between morality and madness. In the end, the truth was both tragic and terrifying. Harold Wainwright had lived and died unnoticed, his victims forgotten, his crimes hidden by the very city that gave him shelter. For over a century, his silence had endured, until chance and time conspired to unearth it. Though justice arrived too late for those he killed, the truth itself became their voice. The case was closed, but its echo lingered, a reminder that beneath London's streets, the past never truly sleeps, and every shadow might still conceal a story waiting to be told.